Wyoming Territory, August 1878. The first scream echoed off the dry canyon walls before the dust cloud even rose behind the wagon. Flora Hensley's face was bloodied, her wrists tied with harness rope, her dress torn and dragging in tatters beneath her. The wheels creaked over packed dirt as the wagon rolled forward, dragging her limp body behind it. Her boots had been lost somewhere back on the trail, and her skin scraped raw by the gravel and sagebrush. She had spoken up about a man striking a child who was not his own. That was all. She had said it clear in front of the town council outside the Grange Hall, called it cruelty, named it what it was, and now she was paying for it. The man on the wagon seat, Rufus Dole, did not even look back as he kept the reins tight in his fists, but someone did. From half a mile off, a lean rider in a sweat-stained hat saw the dust and heard the scream. He kicked his horse into a gallop, rope already coiled and tied to his saddle horn. His name was Yates Judson. He had been riding alone for weeks, headed toward nowhere in particular, his heart worn thin from years of drifting. His rope had saved calves in flash floods, men from river ice, and once even himself from a tree branch when a horse bucked too hard. He carried it always. It was part of him. And now it would save her. Yates rode hard, cutting across the trail, his Mustang's hooves pounding the dry earth. He reached the wagon just as it rounded a bend. "Stop the damn wagon!" he shouted, rifle raised. Rufus turned, startled, mouth open to argue, but Yates fired a shot into the dirt just ahead of the lead horse's hooves. The team reared and halted, and for a moment, silence fell, broken only by the rattling wheels and the ragged breath of the woman tied behind. Yates leapt down and rushed to her. Her face was streaked with dirt and blood, her hands trembling. She looked up at him with dazed eyes, one already swelling shut. "Do not touch me," she rasped, her voice hoarse. "Please." "I will not hurt you," Yates said gently, crouching down. "I swear it." She flinched anyway. He pulled his knife and sliced through the rope at her wrists. Her hands fell like dead weight into his. He caught her carefully, lifting her into his arms with a tenderness that made her blink in disbelief. "You are safe now. I have you," he said. Rufus climbed off the wagon, red-faced and spitting. "That woman's a liar. She accused me of— I do not care what she said." Yates cut him off, standing with Flora still in his arms. "You dragged a woman like a sack of feed behind a wagon. I saw it with my own eyes. You want to press your luck, do it somewhere else. She is done with you." Rufus's mouth opened, then closed. He turned back toward the wagon and climbed on without another word. Yates looked down at the woman in his arms. Her head lolled against his shoulder, her breathing shallow. "Let me take you somewhere safe." She did not answer, but her fingers curled into the front of his shirt. Yates rode with her slumped against him, her eyes fluttering open and closed, dust clinging to her lashes. He rode until the sun dipped low and the cottonwoods along the river cast long shadows. He knew a place, a trapper's cabin long abandoned, a mile off the main trail, where he had once holed up during a snowstorm. He laid her on the cot, covering her with his coat. Then he knelt beside her and poured water into a tin cup, lifting her head to help her drink. She winced on every swallow. "Name's Yates Judson," he said quietly. "I reckon you ought to know." She stared at him a long moment before whispering, "Flora Hensley." He nodded. "That is a strong name." Her lip trembled. "They were going to kill me. I know." He sat by her side through the night. When she woke shaking, he held her hand until she stopped. When she cried, he said nothing, just offered silence and warmth. By morning, she could sit up. By that afternoon, she asked if he had any bread. He smiled then, just a little. 3 days passed. Her bruises darkened and faded, the cuts scabbed, and her voice returned. She moved stiffly, but she walked. She asked for flint and kindling. She insisted on boiling water herself. "You do not need to prove anything to me," Yates said one evening, watching her kneel by the fire. "I do," she said, glancing at him. "I need to feel like I still belong to myself." He nodded, not pressing further. They shared beans and silence. They watched the stars from the porch together. One night, she leaned her head against his shoulder, and he did not move, afraid it would break the spell. She told him about her life, how her father had passed, how she had taken care of a neighbor's 2 children after their mother died, only to be cast aside when their father remarried. How she had thought she could make a difference in town, speak up for what was right. They said I should know my place, she said bitterly. You do, Yates said, right here, alive, not broken. She looked at him, then really looked, and something in her chest shifted. On the 6th day, he saddled his horse. I am going back to town, he said, to report what they did. If I do not, they will think they can do it again. She stared at him, her face unreadable. You think they will listen to you? I do not care if they listen, he said. I will make sure they know someone saw, that someone will speak. She stood slowly. Then I am coming with you, he hesitated. Flora, I am not hiding anymore. He searched her face for any sign of fear, but there was only resolve and pride. He gave a small nod. Then we ride at dawn. They rode side by side into town 2 days later, wind in their faces and dust in their hair. People gawked from porches and steps. Flora's bruises had faded, but the scars on her arms told the story just fine. Yates stood beside her in the sheriff's office, arms crossed, voice steady as stone. Rufus Dole was arrested that night. And Flora looked at the man who had knelt beside her, who had carried her in his arms, who had stood watch through every hour of her pain, and something in her heart opened wide. They walked out of the office together, and she stopped him in the street with a hand on his chest. You saved my life. He looked down at her, eyes warm. You saved your own. I just helped. She looked up at him, her fingers curling into his shirt again, the same way they had that first day. I do not want you to ride off. I was not planning to, he said softly. Not unless you tell me to. I will not. They stood in the middle of the street, the sun dipping low behind them, and when he leaned in and kissed her, it was not rushed, not desperate, it was quiet and full, like the end of a long storm. And for the first time in a long while, Flora felt like she belonged exactly where she was. The house Yates rented stood west of town, plain as a tin cup, perched near a wind-worn bluff where the grass bent low in steady wind. The roof sloped uneven, patched with old shingles and tar, and the door stuck if you didn't lift it just so. But it was his, and when he led Flora through it for the first time, she stepped past the threshold like it was holy ground. She didn't speak until he'd unlatched the windows and rolled back the oilcloth that covered the small table by the stove. Then, quietly, she said, I'd forgotten what peace felt like. Yates didn't answer, only took off his hat and hung it on the nail by the door, then bent to fix the firebox. His shirt clung to the back of his neck with sweat, and his boots left dry prints across the floorboards. She watched him kneel by the stove, his movements easy and practiced, a man who knew how to tend his own hearth. Later, she walked the small yard behind the house, where a few tatters of last year's corn still stood in rows, and a chicken wire pen leaned half-collapsed against a cottonwood. He'd never said much about himself, but the land told her enough. He lived plain, worked steady, and kept to himself. Inside, he poured water into a basin and left it on the washstand without a word, then stepped out to give her a moment of privacy. She washed with slow hands, careful of the healing scabs along her arms. Her reflection in the water's surface looked older than she remembered. Not ruined, just changed. When she came out, Yates sat on the porch, sharpening his knife with long, even strokes. The sound of steel on stone rasped softly in the fading light. I'd like to find work, she said, standing at the edge of the porch. Honest work. I don't want pity. He looked up, knife paused mid-stroke. There's a woman down near the livery. Widow named Bertram, runs a seam shop out of her front room. She's getting on in years, hands shake too bad for fine work. Been looking for help. Flora stepped down into the dirt. Would you introduce me? I will. She folded her arms, squinting toward the horizon. They still stare in town. They'll stop. "You sure of that?" "No," he said, "but I am sure of you." He didn't say anything else, and she didn't need him to. The following morning, she braided her hair smooth and wore the gray calico dress she'd washed and mended herself. Yates stood waiting with the horses saddled, his own coat rolled and tied behind the cantle. The ride into town passed quiet. She didn't cling to the saddle horn like she had that first day. She sat straight, heels down, moving with the gait of the mare like she'd been raised to it. Widow Bertram eyed her closely over the rim of her spectacles, her mouth a flat line until Flora threaded a needle without trembling and stitched a hem true and clean. The old woman nodded once and pointed toward a basket of shirts. "She stays," she said. When Yates came to collect her that evening, she met him on the porch with thread still clinging to her sleeves and a smear of chalk on her palm. "She gave me supper, said I work faster than she expected." "I reckon she's right," Yates said. They rode home just as the sun slipped behind the ridge. At the house, he lit the lantern and she set the kettle on. They moved in rhythm now. He chopped wood while she set plates, she swept while he patched the fence line. One night she found an old tin box tucked beneath a floorboard near the stove. Inside were letters, 4 of them, folded and worn. He came in while she was holding them and stopped short. "I didn't mean to pry," she said, setting them down. "They're from my brother," he said. "He died in the war," she waited. "He wrote me after Vicksburg, told me not to come back east, said I'd seen too much, told me to find someplace quiet and build something better." She closed the box gently. "You listened. Not right away. But I got there." He didn't mention his brother again, and she didn't ask. Days passed. Then weeks. Her bruises faded completely, and her voice took on steadier tones, clipped and sure. She went to town most mornings, always returning before dusk. On Sundays, they split firewood and sat on the porch with mugs of chicory. One evening, after the first frost, he found her standing in the middle of the yard, staring at the clothesline. "I want to put roots down," she said. He stepped beside her and looked toward the house. "This place'll hold him." "I want a garden," she added, "and hens that don't wander off. We can build a better pen." She nodded slowly, then turned to him. "I want to stay," she said, quieter now, "but not just because it's safe." He held her gaze. "Then stay for me." She stepped closer, until there was no air between them, and reached up, her fingers brushing the side of his jaw. "I choose you, Yates Judson, not out of gratitude, not out of fear, just because I do." His hands found her waist, steady and warm. "Then it's settled," he said. She kissed him first this time, soft and certain, and when they broke apart, she rested her forehead against his chest. That night, the lamp burned low while she mended a sleeve, and he carved a new latch for the henhouse door. The silence between them was full, not empty, and when they lay down at last, it was side by side, with the wind outside and the warmth of each other to carry them through the dark. The autumn wind came down from the mountains sharp, with the tang of pine and cold earth, and the aspens along the edge of the property turned gold without asking permission. In the early mornings, frost glittered on the fence rails, and Flora learned to warm her hands by cradling the coffee pot before pouring. Yates had taken on hauling lumber for the mill west of town, gone by light and back by dusk, his shirts dusted with saw grit and his knuckles raw from rope burn. Flora spent the days at the widow's, hemming sleeves and setting patches, her fingertips roughened by thread. She'd started bringing home scraps, bits of muslin, and ticking to stitch into covers for the windows, or to line the one drawer that didn't sit level. One evening, she set a folded bundle of cloth on Yates' side of the table. "Found this in a trunk the widow let go cheap," she said. "Could use it for a new shirt." He ran his hand over the fabric wool, soft and deep brown, and looked at her. "You make it, I'll wear it." She didn't smile. Instead, she picked up her shears and said, "Then hold still." He stood while she measured his shoulders, marking quietly with chalk. Her hands moved with steady purpose, but when they brushed his collarbone, her breath caught. He noticed, but said nothing. just watched her with the patience of a man who knew the value of silence. Later that night, seated on the porch with his legs stretched out and her mending in her lap, he said, "You ever think about what comes next?" She didn't answer at once, just kept her needle moving. "Then, I think about keeping chickens through winter. I think about fixing the south wall before it leans worse. I think about your boots needing new soles." He turned his head toward her. "I meant further on." Her hands stopped. "What are you asking, Yates?" He looked out over the dark field, the stars just beginning to show. "If you ever think about marrying again." She didn't speak for a long while. The only sound between them was the creak of the porch boards beneath their weight. "I never married before," she said finally. "I wore someone else's ring once. It never sat right." He nodded, slow. "I'm not asking you now, just wondering if you'd ever want to hear it when the time is right." She folded the cloth in her lap, set it aside, and stood. "I'd want it to be plain," she said. "Not a gesture, just truth spoken clear." He rose too, brushing his hands on the thighs of his trousers. "That's the only way I know." She didn't touch him, didn't need to. Her eyes met his, sure and steady. The next morning, she found a crate of applewood by the back step. Not cut, not split. Just waiting. She tied on a kerchief and went to work with the hatchet. By the time Yates returned, her arms ached and her palms blistered, but the pile stood neatly stacked beneath the lean-to. He stepped off his horse, took one look, and said nothing. Just walked up behind her, took her hands into his and wrapped them gently with cloth torn from the edge of his own shirt. She sat on the porch that night with her hands wrapped and quiet in her lap, while he read aloud from the only book in the house, a tattered Psalms bound in cracked leather. "You read like you mean it," she said. "Only way to read a thing," he replied. The days shortened. Snow dusted the hills. Widow Bertram's joints stiffened, and Flora offered to take over measuring customers. She didn't ask permission, just stepped into the space where she was needed and made herself useful. That was her way. Yates, meanwhile, traded for a second wagon and began hauling coal south to the rail spur. He left earlier now and came home after dark, smelling of smoke and horses. One evening, she met him at the door with a basin of warm water and a cloth warmed by the stove. "You don't need to do that," he said. "I know," she replied. His eyes softened, and he let her clean the soot from his face without protest. A week later, she found him smoothing the earth behind the house with a spade. He was marking out rows. "You planning for spring?" she asked. He nodded. "I figured we'd put in carrots and beans. Squash if the ground holds." She stepped into the square he'd cleared, looked down at the dark soil, and said, "We'll need to fence it. Keep out the mule deer." He straightened, leaning on the spade. "You saying it's yours too now?" She didn't answer. Just stepped closer and took the spade from his hands. That night, she lit the lamp early and set out the wool shirt she'd finished neat seams, cuffs that matched. She didn't say a word when he came in, just handed it to him and waited. He pulled it on without ceremony, buttoned it up and looked at her. "Well," he said, "guess that settles it." She reached up, brushed a speck of lint from his shoulder. "Guess it does." And when they turned down the lamp and climbed into bed, it was not with hesitation or fear, but with the quiet knowing of people who had built something between them, slow, honest, and meant to last. The first snow came sudden, settling heavy on the roof before the garden rows were fully cleared. Yates brought in the last of the squash that morning, boots caked with frozen mud, and Flora set to curing them on the hearth ledge with a folded quilt beneath. The house smelled of wood smoke and parsnips, and when she opened the door to shake out the rugs, the wind stung her cheeks raw. That evening, she hemmed a strip of blue ticking for a curtain to hang over the washstand. Yates sat on the floor beside her, oiling the worn leather of his saddle bags. The light between them flickered low. "You ever been further west?" she asked, not looking up. "Once. Drove cattle to Fort Bridger. Didn't care for the wind down that way." She nodded, cutting thread with her teeth. "I thought about California once. Years back." "What stopped you?" My brother said it wasn't a place for women with plain hands and no money, said I'd vanish out there. You might have. She folded the cloth twice and set it aside. But I didn't. I stayed and saw the worst of people. And then the best. He kept working the oil into the leather, quiet for a long while. I've been thinking, he said eventually, about building a new shed come spring, something tight enough for a milk cow. She leaned back against the chair leg. You planning to buy one? Only if I know someone who'll help tend her. Her mouth curved just slightly. She'd need hay and a proper pail, and I'd want a butter churn. He nodded once. I can carve one. She looked at him then fully and said, You're planning for us. I am. She pushed the curtain fabric aside and stood. Then I should tell you something, before it gets to mattering too much. He rose too, slow, careful. All right. Not everyone in that town believed what they said about me, but not enough stood up either. There's one woman, Mary Calhoun, she looked after me when I could barely stand, hid me in her cellar until I could walk again. I remember her, he said. She came out when we testified. She's due to have her third child in February. Her husband's gone out to Cheyenne working rail crews. She's alone. If she asks, I want to help her. Stay a few days at a time if I'm needed. His brow furrowed, but only slightly. You're not asking my leave. I'm not. He stepped forward, not close, but enough that she could see the steadiness behind his words. Then I'll ride you there when the time comes and fetch you home again. She reached out and laid her hand against his chest, just over his heart. Thank you. That night, the wind howled against the windows hard enough to shake the panes. Yates rose after midnight to check the shutters, and when he returned to bed, she pulled his arm around her waist beneath the quilts. Neither of them said anything, but their breathing fell into rhythm, slow and even, like water smoothing stone. By late December, the trail to town was near impassable. Flora and Yates lived quiet, the days marked by small tasks, mending harness, boiling soap, carding wool into batting. He found time to carve a second chair for the table, notched clean and solid. When he presented it to her, she ran her hand along the backrest without speaking. The chair sat across from his now, and they ate facing one another, even when the stew was thin and the bread was hard. One morning she sat by the window, patching her winter shawl, and said, Have you noticed how still it gets, just before the sun breaks through snow cloud? I have, he said. It's the sort of quiet you can feel in your teeth. She smiled, barely. That's what this place feels like to me. All the time. He looked up from where he was shaping a wooden peg for the barn door. Still, no, full, like something waiting to grow. He set the peg down and crossed to her. Then let it grow. She stood, her shawl slipping from her lap, and took his hand. I want to be your wife. His breath caught just once. Then I'll ask you proper. She shook her head. You already built the chair. That was enough. He stepped closer. Will you marry me, Flora Hensley? Yes, Yates Judson. I will. They sealed it with a kiss by the window, the snow still falling soft and slow outside. There was no church, no crowd, no ring, just two people who had weathered the worst of the world and found each other whole. The next morning, they walked the fence line in the hush of fresh snow, her hand tucked in his coat pocket, and made plans for the spring. The thaw came slow that March, with the land easing itself out of frost like a body waking from a long illness. The creek behind the house ran high with meltwater, and the cottonwoods near the bank began to bud with the first pale green tips. Flora rose early most mornings to sweep the porch and scatter cornmeal where the path stayed slick, her breath still visible in the cold. One morning, she stepped outside to find Yates already at the edge of the field, measuring with a bit of twine and a sharpened stick. She watched him from the steps, arms wrapped around herself, until he looked up. I thought we'd start Rose on the west side, he called. So we catch the longest light. She walked out, boots crunching on the frozen grass. You've got an eye for the sun now. He stuck the measuring stick into the ground and looked toward the ridge. I've got an eye for what's worth tending. They marked the rows together, her hands still wrapped in her shawl, his bare and red from cold. She didn't ask him to stop, and he didn't offer. The work felt like a promise. By the first week of April, the widow's shop reopened, and Flora rode into town twice a week, her mended shawl traded in for a light jacket she'd pieced together from leftover wool. On her second trip back, she brought a small parcel wrapped in brown paper and tucked it into the drawer beside the stove without comment. That evening, Yates opened the drawer to fetch the salt tin and found the parcel. He turned to her, brow raised. "I traded for a pair of shears," she said, wiping her hands on a dishcloth. "The right kind for tailoring men's coats." He set the paper back without unfolding it. "You planning to sew for others again?" She leaned against the counter. "Not just for others." That night, after supper, he brought out a piece of scrap pine and began carving again. She didn't ask what it would be. She trusted that whatever he shaped, it would fit into the life they were building. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived, carried in by one of the Miller boys who worked the telegraph. Flora read it at the table, lips pressed tight, and folded it twice before setting it down. "She's asking," she said. Yates turned from the stove. "Mary, she's due in less than 10 days. Her sister fell ill, can't come out from Laramie." He nodded once. "We'll leave in the morning." Flora stared at the letter. "It might be a week, maybe longer." "She looked after you," he said. "You do the same for her." The next morning, he packed her a tin of dried apples and a wrapped loaf of bread, tucked her mending needle into a cloth pouch, and handed her the reins of the mare. She didn't say goodbye. Just kissed him once, steady and certain, and rode out with the sun barely above the horizon. He spent her absence mending the barn floor and splitting cedar for fence posts. At night, he sat in the chair she'd sewn a cushion for and read aloud to the empty room, voice low and even. When the wind picked up, he checked the windows twice instead of once. On the 9th day she returned. He heard the hoofbeats first, then saw her come into view, wrapped in her wool jacket, her braid loose from wind. He stepped out before she reached the porch. "Boy or girl?" he asked. "Girl," she said, sliding down from the saddle. "Strong lungs." He took the reins and tied them to the post, then turned back. "And Mary," resting, "her neighbors come to help now." She didn't move to enter the house. Instead, she stood there, looking at him in the gray light. "I thought about this place every night. I thought about your hands on that fence line and the way the fire pops when the kettle's near to boil. I thought about you," he said. "Every morning, every mile I walked." She stepped forward. "I don't want any more days away from you." "Then stay," he said, "and let's build the rest of it." They went inside, and she hung her jacket on the peg beside his. The room smelled of cedar and clean earth, and the quilt she'd sewn lay folded at the foot of their bed. She placed her hand on the table, palm flat against the worn wood. "I want a child," she said. Yates looked up from the stove, his eyes steady. "Then we'll raise one, here, together." She crossed to him and laid her head against his shoulder. He pressed his palm to her back, fingers spreading wide. They didn't speak again that night, not with words. They lit the lamp low and left the window open just enough to let in the cool spring air. When they lay down, it was with the quiet certainty of people who had found home not in land or walls, but in one another. By midsummer, the garden rose had taken root, and the henhouse held 5 birds that laid steady. Flora stitched a christening gown from soft cotton and tucked it away in a cedar box. Yates built a cradle from pine beams, the same hands that once carried her now shaping the place where their child would sleep. The town never whispered again. They had nothing left to say. In late August, Flora sat on the porch with her feet up, belly round beneath her apron, while Yates brought in the last of the corn. She called him over and handed him a folded scrap of paper. "What's this?" he asked. "A name," she said. He opened it, read it, and nodded. "It's a good one." They watched the sun go down together, and when the light faded, he helped her inside, one hand at the small of her back. The house held their laughter, their quiet, their shared breath through long nights. It held the scent of baking bread and oilskin, of lavender hung from the rafters and wood smoke curling from the chimney. It held two lives, knit together not by chance but by choice. And when their daughter came, healthy and loud, Yates wept for the second time in his life. The first had been the day Flora said yes. They named the baby Ruth. Years passed. The garden grew wild at the edges. The barn was painted red one summer just because Flora wanted it so. Ruth learned to walk on the same porch her mother once swept before dawn, and her first words were spoken by the hearth where her parents had mended and read and loved. In the evenings, Flora still sat in her sewing chair, and Yates still read aloud. Sometimes from the Psalms, sometimes from the paper that came in once a month, the corners worn soft by time. They grew old the way good trees do side by side, roots deep, branches bent toward one another. No one ever dragged Flora again. No one ever asked Yates where he was headed. They had arrived, and they stayed,